Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today, it's all about gas exchange. You know, oxygen, carbon dioxide, that whole keeping our bodies in balance thing.
The stuff of life, right.
Absolutely. You sent over some really interesting medical training materials on analyzing and monitoring gas exchange. Kind of like a crash course in respiratory care.
Yeah, I thought those would be right up your alley.
Definitely. So we're going to break it all down for our listeners. Ever wonder how doctors measure the gases in your blood?
Or what those little finger clips they use at the hospital are all about.
Exactly. We're going to unlock all those secrets today.
It's pretty fascinating stuff when you think about it. We're talking about something we literally do every second of every day. Breathing.
Right. But we don't usually think about the science behind it.
And that's what we're going to do today. Look at it from two perspectives, actually. Analyzing a single point in time and then monitoring it continuously over time. Like snapshots versus a video.
Ah, that's a good analogy. And the materials you sent actually make a clear distinction between analysis and monitoring.
Yeah.
Right. Analysis is like taking a sample, a blood sample, say, and examining it. It gives you a snapshot of what's happening right now.
Gotcha. Like a single frame in a movie.
Exactly. And then monitoring, that's an ongoing real-time process. You're tracking how things change over time.
Like watching the whole movie unfold. And for medical professionals, this distinction is, well, it's gotta be huge.
Oh, absolutely. It's the difference between seeing a single data point and seeing the trend, the big picture. It's crucial for making decisions about patient care.
Like knowing whether a patient's condition is stable or if it's getting worse.
Precisely. It's like, imagine trying to figure out why a car is making a funny noise.
Yeah.
Right? A mechanic might listen to the engine for a second, that's analysis. But to really diagnose the problem, they need to take it for a test drive, see how it performs over time.
That's monitoring. You're getting the full story. So cool how that applies to the human body, too. Okay, let's dive into some specifics here. One of the tools mentioned in your materials is oxygen analyzers.
Ah, yes, those are essential in respiratory care.
The source talks about two main types. Electrochemical.
Which is further broken down into galvanic and polarizographic.
Right, galvanic. I gotta say, that word always makes me think of Frankenstein's lab for some reason.
Uh-huh. Well, maybe not that dramatic, but they're pretty cool devices. Both galvanic and polarizographic analyzers use chemical reactions to figure out how much oxygen is present.
Chemical reactions, huh? So how does that actually work?
Basically, think of it like a tiny battery. Oxygen acts as the fuel, and the more fuel you have, the stronger the electrical current.
Okay, so it's measuring the strength of the current to tell you how much oxygen is there.
Exactly. And they can convert those electrical signals into something we can understand. The partial pressure of oxygen, or even the percentage of oxygen in a gas mixture.
But the materials also mention that things like water, pressure, even altitude can mess with those readings, right?
Absolutely. All those things can influence the chemical reactions happening inside the analyzer.
So even these high-tech gadgets aren't perfect.
No, they're not foolproof. That's why calibration is so important. Just like you calibrate a kitchen scale to make sure it's accurate, medical professionals calibrate oxygen analyzers regularly.
To make sure those readings are spot on.
Exactly. Because an inaccurate oxygen reading could lead to a wrong medical decision, and that's definitely something we want to avoid.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to something a little more intense. Arterial blood sampling.
Ah, yes. Getting down to the nitty-gritty.
Right, so imagine you're in the hospital and the doctor orders a blood gas analysis. What happens next? I'm picturing needles and maybe a little drama.
Uh-huh. Well, it might not be as dramatic as TV makes it seem, but needles are definitely involved.
Right, gotta get that blood sample somehow. But why an artery? Why not just a regular vein like for most blood tests?
Good question. It's because arteries carry oxygen-rich blood from the heart. That gives us a direct look at how well your lungs are oxygenating your blood.
Ah, I see. It's the freshest blood, straight from the source. But I imagine sticking a needle in an artery is a bit more delicate than a regular blood draw.
You're right, it is. That's why doctors are super careful about which artery they choose. They look for one that has good collateral circulation.
Collateral circulation. That sounds complicated.
Not really. Think of it like a detour on a highway. If one route's blocked, you need another way to get where you're going.
So it's like having a backup route for your blood flow.
Exactly. If there's a problem with the artery they're sampling, collateral circulation ensures that blood can still get to the tissues.
Makes sense. The source mentioned the radial artery in the wrist is a common target for this. Why there?
Well, it's easily accessible, relatively close to the surface, and it has good collateral circulation from the ulnar artery.
So it's a safe bet. But before they even take the sample, they do a little test, right? Something called the modified Allen's test.
Yep. That's to double check that ulnar artery detour is working properly.
Okay, so how does that work?
Basically, they ask you to make a fist, and then they block both the radial and ulnar arteries in your wrist. When you open your hand, they release the ulnar artery and watch to see if your hand turns pink again quickly.
Ah, so if it does, that means the backup route is good to go.
Exactly. It's like a mini game for your hand to make sure everything's working right.
Safety first. Love it. So let's say they do the Allen's test and everything looks good. They get the blood sample. Where does it go next?
To a very special machine called a blood gas analyzer.
Ooh, high tech. What does that do exactly?
It measures 3 key values in the blood sample: pH, PO2, and PCO2.
Okay, break this down for me. What do those letters and numbers actually tell us?
All right, so pH, that tells us how acidic or alkaline the blood is.
Gotcha.
Then there's PO2, which stands for the partial pressure of oxygen. Basically, it tells us how much oxygen is dissolved in the blood.
Ah, so it's not just about how much oxygen is getting in, but also how well it's actually getting into the blood itself.
You got it. And finally, we have PCO2, which is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. That reflects how well your body is getting rid of that waste product.
So it's a two-way street. Got to get the good stuff in and the bad stuff out. Interesting. But wait, the materials mentioned something about temperature affecting these readings too.
Yeah, that's a good point. The temperature of the blood sample can actually affect the readings.
Really? Why is that?
Think of it like a thermometer. If you leave it in a hot car, it'll give you a higher reading than if you leave it in a cool room.
Ah, so the temperature can skew the results.
Exactly. That's why blood gas analyzers have a built-in temperature correction feature. They take the patient's body temperature into account and adjust the readings accordingly.
So it's like a super smart thermometer, making sure those results are accurate. But drawing blood, even from the wrist, sounds, maybe a little uncomfortable. Are there any ways to monitor gas exchange without all the needles?
You bet. That's where transcutaneous monitoring comes in.
Ooh, transcutaneous. That sounds fancy.
It is pretty cool. It's a way to measure oxygen and carbon dioxide levels through the skin using special electrodes.
Wait, through the skin? How is that even possible?
It might sound like science fiction, but gases can actually pass through the skin.
Wow, I never knew that. So how does it actually work?
They use these special electrodes that are heated to a specific temperature. This helps open up those tiny pathways in the skin and allows the gases to diffuse through.
Ah, so it's like creating a little temporary sauna for your skin so the gases can escape and be measured.
Exactly. And this method is particularly useful for monitoring babies.
Oh, right, because their skin is thinner.
Exactly. More permeable, so it's much easier to keep tabs on their breathing without having to constantly draw blood.
Oh yeah, way less stressful for everyone involved. But what about adults or people who need, more constant, precise monitoring? Is this transcutaneous monitoring good enough for them?
It's great for getting a general idea of how things are going, but for those critical care situations where accuracy is absolutely crucial, we need something a bit more invasive.
Ah, so back to needles then.
Not necessarily needles. But we do need to get a sensor closer to the action, That's where intra-arterial monitoring comes in.
So we're talking about putting a sensor directly into an artery.
You got it. Like having a tiny, dedicated reporter stationed right inside the blood vessel, giving us real-time updates on those oxygen and carbon dioxide levels.
Wow, that's pretty high-tech. But I can't imagine it's without risks, right? We are talking about putting something inside an artery.
You're right. There are always risks involved with any medical procedure. That's why this type of monitoring is really reserved for those patients who are critically ill and need that constant, super accurate stream of info.
Right. So the benefits have to outweigh those risks.
Exactly. And to minimize the risks, doctors carefully select the artery and they use specialized catheters and sensors to make the procedure as safe as possible.
Makes sense. It's like a delicate balancing act, right? Weighing the potential risks against the benefits of getting that crucial information. Speaking of risks, I remember the materials mentioned a few potential complications with arterial blood sampling, like arteriospasm and hematomas. I gotta say, those sound a bit scary.
It's important to remember those complications are relatively rare, especially when skilled healthcare professionals are involved. And those terms, they're just fancy words for things like a spasm in the artery or a small bruise where the needle went in.
Okay, that makes me feel a bit better. But I'm guessing those risks are even higher with continuous monitoring since you're leaving that sensor in the artery for longer.
Yes, that's true. But again, patient safety is always the top priority. doctors carefully weigh the risks and benefits for each individual patient.
And they only use intra-arterial monitoring when it's absolutely necessary.
Right, and they monitor the patient closely for any signs of complications.
It all comes back to that open communication between doctors and patients, doesn't it? Making sure everyone understands the risks and benefits and working together to make those best decisions.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us to another super important aspect of all these techniques we've been talking about. Quality control.
Quality control. You mean like making sure the machines are all working properly?
Exactly. When it comes to medical testing, accuracy is everything.
Right. A wrong reading could lead to the wrong treatment.
Exactly. Like, imagine getting a lab result that says your blood sugar is sky high, but it's actually perfectly normal. That could lead to unnecessary medication or even a hospital stay.
Yikes. Not good. So how do they make sure these machines are giving accurate readings then?
Laboratories and hospitals have very strict protocols in place to make sure everything's running smoothly. It's a constant process of checks and balances. They run control samples with known values to make sure the machines are calibrated correctly. And they do regular maintenance, keep everything in tip-top shape.
So it's like giving the machines a regular tune-up, just like you would with your car.
Exactly. And that meticulous attention to detail is crucial. That's how we make sure patients are getting the most accurate, reliable test results possible.
It's like a chain of trust. From the scientists who develop the technology, to the technicians who maintain it, to the doctors who interpret the results, all working together to ensure that patients receive the best possible care.
Well said. And speaking of technology, it's always evolving, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, any new breakthroughs on the horizon in the world of gas exchange analysis and monitoring?
That's a great question. I mean, we've talked about analyzing blood samples, poking arteries, even measuring gases through the skin. What's next? Are we going to be beaming these readings directly from our bodies to our phones?
Well, we're not quite there yet. But scientists are definitely working on new and innovative ways to make these processes even better.
So what are some of the most exciting developments you're seeing?
One area that's particularly promising is the development of non-invasive continuous blood gas monitoring. Remember how we talked about intra-arterial monitoring, where they put a sensor directly into the artery?
Yeah, that one sounded kind of intense.
Well, imagine being able to get that same level of continuous, accurate monitoring without having to put anything inside the body.
Wait, really? Is that even possible?
Researchers are working on it. It's still early stages, but there are some really cool technologies being developed. Some are using light to measure blood gases through the skin, similar to pulse oximetry, but much more sophisticated.
So like a super-powered finger clip that can tell you everything about your blood gases without drawing any blood.
Exactly. Others are developing tiny implantable sensors that can continuously monitor blood gases and transmit that data wirelessly to a healthcare provider. It's like having a tiny lab inside your body.
That sounds straight out of a sci-fi movie. But if it could help people manage their health and avoid complications, that would be incredible.
Absolutely. And these advancements aren't just about making things easier or more convenient. They have the potential to revolutionize the way we approach healthcare, especially for folks with chronic respiratory conditions.
Okay, I'm officially excited about the future of gas exchange monitoring. But before we get too carried away with all this high-tech talk, let's bring it back to something we're all familiar with. That little finger clip they put on you at the hospital. Pulse oximetry?
The pulse oximeter. It might seem like a simple device, but the science behind it is pretty fascinating. It's all about light and hemoglobin.
Hemoglobin, right. That's the stuff in our red blood cells that carries oxygen.
You got it. And hemoglobin has this interesting property. It absorbs light differently depending on whether it's carrying oxygen or not.
So oxygen-rich hemoglobin looks different under a light than oxygen-poor hemoglobin.
Exactly. And that's the principle the pulse oximeter uses. It shines two different wavelengths of light red and infrared through your fingertip, and it measures how much of each wavelength is absorbed.
So it's kind of like shining a flashlight through colored water. The color of the light changes depending on what's in the water.
That's a great analogy. And just like the color of the light tells you something about the water, the light absorption patterns in the pulse oximeter tell us how much of the hemoglobin in your blood is carrying oxygen.
That's really clever. And that's what that CPO2 number on the pulse oximeter represents, right? The percentage of hemoglobin that's saturated with oxygen.
Exactly. It's a quick and easy way to get a snapshot of how well your lungs are delivering oxygen to your blood.
But the materials also mentioned that certain things can affect the accuracy of those pulse ox readings, right?
That's true. Things that interfere with light transmission. Nail polish, artificial nails, even bright ambient light. those can throw off the readings.
I see.
And poor blood flow to the extremities, like if someone's in shock or hypothermia, that can also affect the accuracy.
So it's not foolproof, but it's still a super valuable tool for monitoring oxygenation.
Absolutely. And speaking of monitoring, we can't forget about capnometry.
Okay, another new word. What is capnometry, and how does it fit into all of this?
Well, capnometry is all about measuring carbon dioxide. But instead of looking at the blood, we're analyzing the breath. Remember how we talked about CO2 being a waste product of our metabolism?
Yeah.
Well, when we exhale, we get rid of that CO2.
So capnometry is like a breathalyzer for CO2.
You could say that. It's often used to confirm proper tube placement during intubation, which is when a tube is inserted into the trachea to help a patient breathe.
Makes sense. You want to make sure that breathing tube is in the right place.
Exactly. And capnometry can also be used to continuously monitor a patient's breathing, which is really important for people on ventilators.
Right. It's all about making sure they're getting enough oxygen and getting rid of that CO2.
Precisely.
The materials also mention that these capnometers, they need to be calibrated regularly, just like those oxygen analyzers we talked about.
Right. Regular calibration is key for any medical device to ensure accuracy.
And that water can sometimes get in and mess things up too.
Yeah, water in the sample lines can occlude them and throw off the readings. So keeping those lines clear is really important.
It's all about those little details, huh?
Absolutely. Attention to detail is critical for ensuring accurate and reliable readings, which in turn are essential for providing the best possible care for patients.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today. From tiny sensors inside arteries to the science behind pulse oximetry.
And we're just getting started. There's a whole world of fascinating stuff to explore when it comes to gas exchange.
It's been quite a journey today, exploring all those different ways to analyze and monitor gas exchange.
Right, from tiny electrical currents to shining light through fingertips. It's amazing how much science goes into something as basic as breathing.
I know. We don't always think about it, but it's pretty mind-blowing. But with all this technical talk, I bet some listeners are thinking, okay, so what? Why does any of this matter to me?
That's a great question. And it's a crucial one. Because whether you're a patient, a healthcare provider, or just someone curious about how your body works, understanding gas exchange can really empower you.
So it's not just about knowing those technical details, it's about understanding what they mean for our health.
Exactly. Like let's say you're at the hospital and you see a doctor looking at a patient's blood gas report, right?
Okay.
Knowing what those numbers mean, the pH, the PO2, PCO2, all that, can help you understand what's happening with the patient's breathing.
So it's like having a secret decoder ring for understanding all that medical jargon.
Exactly. And it can help you advocate for yourself or your loved ones if you're ever in a medical situation.
That's a great point. But even beyond the medical stuff, I think there's a sense of wonder that comes with understanding how our bodies work at such a basic level.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every breath we take involves this intricate exchange of gases. It's happening constantly, millions of times a day, and we don't even have to think about it.
It's easy to take breathing for granted until something goes wrong, right?
Right. And that's where all those technologies we talked about come in.
They're like our early warning system.
Exactly. They give us a window into how our respiratory system is functioning so we can catch problems early on.
Like having a team of mechanics constantly monitoring the engine of our bodies, making sure everything's running smoothly.
I love that analogy. And as technology keeps advancing, we can expect these tools to become even more sophisticated, more personalized.
Speaking of advancements, we talked about some of those earlier, like non-invasive, continuous blood gas monitoring. What other cool things are you excited about in this field?
Well, one area that I find really fascinating is the use of artificial intelligence to analyze all this gas exchange data.
AI, like computers helping doctors make diagnoses.
Exactly. Imagine an AI system that can sift through massive amounts of data from all sorts of sensors and flag potential problems even before a human doctor might notice them.
So it's like having a super smart assistant for doctors, helping them make those critical decisions?
Precisely. And AI has the potential to really revolutionize respiratory care. Earlier diagnoses, more targeted therapies, and ultimately better outcomes for patients.
That's amazing. So as we wrap up this deep dive into gas exchange, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the big takeaway is this. Analyzing and monitoring gas exchange, it's not just some abstract concept. It's fundamental to understanding our health and well-being.
Right. It's about understanding how our bodies work at the most basic level.
Exactly. And by learning about these techniques, we can gain a deeper appreciation for how incredible our bodies are, and we can make more informed choices about our health.
Well said. To all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of gas exchange. It might be something we often take for granted, but as we've learned today, it's vital to our survival.
And if you're curious to learn more, we encourage you to check out those materials you sent over. They're a great starting point for further exploration.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the science that makes us tick.